Greetings, fellow followers of the stars. This is Rick Levine with your April forecast. And rather than recording this live at Soul Food Coffee House here in Redmond, Washington, where I live, this is being recorded from my home office. Obviously, like many of you, I am practicing social distancing and self-quarantining. And this apparently is what we need to do now. It has been said that extraordinary times require or call for extraordinary actions. And in fact, this comes from the aphorisms of Hippocrates, the guy whose oath all physicians take when they become medical doctors. And of course, somehow in modern times, we have forgotten that Hippocrates also said no one should practice medicine without knowledge of the stars. But let's set that one aside. In his aphorisms, he wrote, "For extreme diseases, extreme methods of cure as to restriction are most suitable." And somehow these words seem applicable these days. So we will get to April's chart in just a moment, but I do have a couple of very brief announcements rather than my long list of upcoming events because of the isolation and quarantine that has been imposed on many people around the country, around the world. There's a few things I would like to announce. First of all, my appearance in Denver, Boulder for the Rocky Mountain Astrologers that was in April, that was this month, has now been postponed until September. More information on that will follow. Also, my talk at the Washington State Astrology Association, and that's April 9th with an all-day workshop on April 11th. That's Thursday night, April 9th, and all day on Saturday, April 11th. That has been, like many events, been converted into a virtual event. And on April 9th, I'll be doing a lecture called Unwrapping the Mystery of Time. And that'll be at 7:30 Pacific time. And because it is online and virtual, you can attend this from anywhere in the country. You can go to WA for the state of Washington. So it's www.waastrologers.org, waastrologers.org/upcoming-events to get to the exact page where you'll see my talks. That's April 9th. And on April 11th, I'm doing an all-day workshop on one of my favorite themes in astrology, and it's the astrology of relationships, theory, and practice. I've given variations of this many times before, but this will be a little bit different than other ones. And that'll be from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. With a break for virtual lunch. And information on both of those talks will be at the Washington Astrology Association website. The other announcement that I have that is very important is that Astrology Rising 2, the first Astrology Rising sponsored by Caipacha down in Costa Rica, was 3 years ago. And the one that's scheduled for May 4th to May 10th is actually occurring, but it will occur as a virtual event. On the astrologyrisingcostarica.com website, it says the coronavirus is changing the way we live with each other and our earthly environment from now on. As astrologers, we look forward to sharing our unique perspective on these changes by offering an amazing week-long online summit, Astrology Rising 2020. And the astrologers that are involved in this, excuse me, are Caipacha, Maurice Fernandez, Sol Janasson from Norway, Ari Moshe Wolf, Tim Halloran, Christine Caudle, Nadia Shah, and Julia Simas from Australia, It's going to be quite a week. There'll be over 34 talks. There'll be morning yoga actually done in Zoom sessions, closing panels every day. There'll be virtual dinners. It will be a very interesting week, and you can either take the entire week off from whatever you're already not doing, or just attend a day or a day at a time. There are other talks coming up that I have scheduled. I'm not saying anything about them now. We'll see which ones of those either are postponed, canceled, or become virtual. I'll keep you posted on all of that. And like many of you, I am not immune from dealing with these extraordinary times, these times where old behaviors just simply don't cut it anymore. So without further ado, let's get into some astrology, the astrology of April coming up. And I just want to say on the way into looking at these charts, when things are so extraordinary as they are right now out there, everything that is astrological has to be interpreted or looked at through this larger filter. There can be an aspect that's an excellent aspect, and maybe an aspect that in normal times would denote great social interactions. However, that may not be the case if you are either nurturing an illness, nurturing someone who is battling or working with an illness, or simply stuck within the four walls in which you live. And I think that we just need to keep that in mind. I'm going to look at the aspects for the month ahead, and I'm going to interpret them as I would interpret anything else, because, in other words, as I would interpret any other month. But again, we have to keep in mind that these are rather extraordinary times, and astrology is not immune to falling, I wouldn't say victim, but falling under the influences of these larger events. And this is something that we addressed in a bit more detail in the chart interpretation class last week in March, for those of you who subscribe to that level. So let's jump in. Let me get the chart up, and we will take it from there. Okay, so we are looking at a chart for April 1st, 2020. And as always, when I do these charts, I'm using an Aries rising chart. That Aries rising creates what astrologers call a natural chart wheel, so that each house relates to the sign that is normally associated with that house. And so we have Aries in the first house, Taurus in the second house, and so on all the way around. It's a way of looking at the chart that's valid anywhere on the planet, because although I am here in Redmond, Washington, wherever you are, the sun might be high in the sky here, but it might be the middle of the night where you are. And yet, if we're looking at a chart for a particular moment in time, we're all sharing that chart at that particular moment in time, even though our clocks may say different things, and even though the sun's position and the horizon might be different from place to place. So in order to jump into April, we have to begin by simply recalling the fact that we're still under the influence. We're living under the influence of the Saturn Pluto conjunction, which was exact on January 12th of 2020. Now, for those of you who listen to my reports regularly, you know that I've been talking about the Saturn-Pluto conjunction since Saturn moved into Capricorn back in December of 2017. And although I said Saturn's only real job as it moved through Capricorn was its meeting on January 12th, 2020 with Pluto, the fact of the matter is that the influence of that Saturn-Pluto conjunction has been felt since Saturn moved into Capricorn, and will be continued to be felt for at least a year after the conjunction. Remember, Saturn, although it's now in Aquarius, retrogrades back into Capricorn as if to finish old business before it moves into Aquarius for its final run, and stays then in Aquarius for a couple of years, and it does that in December of this year, December 2020, as Jupiter, now moving through Capricorn, moves also into Aquarius in December of 2020, catches up with Saturn, and that will be a major game changer that I think will kind of finalize this year of larger than normal stuff, although it will also begin its own rhythm, which we will talk about as the year unfolds. So looking at the chart for April 1st, we can see that the remnants of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that occurred back at about 22, 23 degrees of Capricorn, that Pluto has inched on a bit. Pluto is almost at 25 degrees of Capricorn, but Jupiter, which is now moving through Capricorn, is catching up with, and for all practical purposes at the beginning of April, Jupiter is lined up with Pluto, and we will talk about that because that influence is not only here this month, but it's an influence that repeats throughout the year, is really with us until next November, December, when Jupiter, moving direct on its third and final time, will catch up with Pluto again before it moves into Aquarius. So we see that Jupiter and Pluto are conjunct right now on April 1st. They're conjunct within a half a degree, actually within 20 minutes of arc, 21 minutes of arc. But at the same time, we can now see that Saturn has escaped from the Capricorn pack, with Mars having also just escaped, and yesterday, actually, March 31st, Mars actually joined up with Saturn. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that now because I covered that extensively in the March mid-month update, which was made available to everyone. But I do want to say that what we look at here when we see this chart and we see that Mars is now in Aquarius, it's still within orb. It's only 1 degree away from Saturn. So we still have this hot cold, this frustration of Mars wanting to take the ball and run with it, and Saturn saying, no, you're still within my range, and I'm putting up blockades and walls and laws and restrictions and preventing that Mars from running free. On the other hand, Mars does gain distance as it moves away from Saturn all month. And so I think that we will feel the loosening of the binds of these social restrictions as the month unfolds. Excuse me, but they may actually convert into something else. And we'll talk about that as we move on through the month. Let's come back to the Jupiter-Pluto for a moment, because the Jupiter-Pluto aspect is exact on April 4th, and we're really feeling that now. And we'll be feeling that again pretty much all month. Jupiter is the planet of expansion. Jupiter makes anything bigger, better, and more. And as I've been known to say many, many times, that too much of a good thing is not necessarily a good thing. That things in proportion work, but Jupiter, which is often given the it's given the meaning of making things better. It's making things more positive. Jupiter is optimistic. It's positive. It's expansive. Jupiter is growth. But you know, when you're looking at a pandemic, whether that pandemic is a pandemic of a physical virus or whether it's a pandemic of fear, Jupiter is basically expanding that energy. So we have to be careful that of just jumping to the conclusion that when Jupiter lines up with Pluto, it makes the difficult, more positive. It makes it more. And we're certainly seeing that right now. And remember that Pluto, as the lord of the underworld, Pluto is the shadow. Pluto is that which we fear. Pluto is the unconscious. I'm reminded of Joseph Campbell, who said, the cave that you fear the most is the one with the greatest treasure. And here we have Jupiter basically forcing people, or at least strongly encouraging people to face their fears, whether it's a fear of not having enough food to eat, whether it's a fear of not having enough toilet paper, whether it's a fear of death, whether it's a fear of dealing with the contagion of those you love and the uncertainty of what's happening. These are all plutonic fears that are in the unconscious always. And right now, as Jupiter is coming up over that Pluto, it's bringing them out into the open. And a lot of this has to do with how we respond to this. I've said many times before, and I will say again now, that fate is what happens to us, free will is how we respond. And I think here the response to these contagions that we're experiencing has to do with being open to the information, facing our fears, and actually moving through them. Denial does not function here. When Jupiter lines up with Pluto, it almost makes the energy too big, too great to be pushed back down under the surface. And I think that those people who are or were in denial are one by one realizing, no, there's something here that needs to be contended with. And I want to be careful here because there's many schools of thought, and my goal here is not to alienate anyone, but to simply open our minds that epidemics occur. Epidemics occur regularly on the planet, and we can look at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction cycle and see that it was active at the time of Black Death in 1350. It was active around the time of the Spanish flu, what's called the Spanish flu plague or pandemic of 1918, even though it's documented that those cases began in 1914. It was around in 1947 at the polio epidemic, at 1982 at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. So this is not, from an astrological standpoint, unusual. What's unusual is the speed at which communication occurs, not only through social media like this, but the speed at which the actual communication of the virus occurs because of how much air travel and how much movement there is, unprecedented to anything in the past. And so what we're seeing is something that is very real, but it's also not it's not unexpected, and I think that the one thing that I want to say before I leave this topic is that with all the money that's being dumped into, at least in the United States and many other countries, into coronavirus protection, stimulation, government, into giving people, individuals money, perhaps not enough to live, survive. That the thing to me that's most significant is that there's no money being devoted to helping people strengthen their immune system. And I know this isn't astrological, but it really is, because if there's any one thing that we all can be doing now, it's anything that helps strengthen our immune system. I'm not a medical doctor. I've never played one on TV, but there's plenty of resources to go online and to explore how you can do that within the confines of your own home, and that becomes a really important key here. So Jupiter-Pluto, which is exact on April 4th, is certainly active right now, and it's turning this into into something, I don't want to say more than it is, because it is what it is, but it's turning it into something that's extremely important, especially because the degrees of this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction are basically very close to where first Saturn made the conjunctions to Pluto, and then Mars swept through last month, making the conjunctions to Jupiter, Pluto, and now to Saturn. And so this is an extraordinary pileup, but it's important to understand that now that Mars and Saturn have moved into Aquarius, we're beginning to see, I don't want to say the light at the end of the tunnel, we're beginning to see the tunnel itself rather than just being wrapped up in the moment. And the tunnel may not be the tunnel that we would like. We are moving here into the future at a very rapid pace, and this is requiring adjustment on everyone's part. And again, I think that this is very much a theme for the month. Now, the other thing we note in this chart is that we have Mercury at 16 degrees of Pisces. Now, remember, Mercury had turned retrograde back in February. Retrograde, it was in Pisces. It was at about 12, 13 degrees of Pisces. When it turned retrograde, it backed up into Aquarius. And now that it's moving into new degrees of Pisces, Mercury is technically out of its shadow. What does that mean? It means that Mercury is moving in areas of the sky where it has not yet been, because it turned retrograde at 13 degrees of Pisces. And so in April, we have Mercury now moving very fast, Mercury picking up speed still, but it's moving fast, and it's moving in areas of the sky where it hasn't been this entire cycle, which means that communication is excited, communication is moving forward. However, it's also important to note that on April 1st, Mercury is at 16 degrees of Pisces, Neptune is at 19 degrees of Pisces, which means that Mercury is coming into conjunct Neptune, and because Mercury is moving very quickly now, that will happen on April 3rd. The other thing that happens at the beginning of April is that Venus, which has been moving through Taurus, Venus at home in Taurus, Venus actually leaves Taurus and enters Gemini on April 3rd also. So I'm going to move this chart ahead a day at a time, and here is the second. And here is the third, and you can see on the third that Venus has moved into Gemini and that Mercury is now aligned with Neptune. So Mercury aligning with Neptune, you know, Neptune's role in all of this is very significant, because what we're really dealing with, remember, every time Saturn and Pluto line up, we have boundary issues, whether those boundary issues are basically religious beliefs bumping into conflicting religious beliefs, whether they're wars between nations and they have to do with nationalistic boundaries, whether they have to do with belief systems or science breakthroughs. The whole Copernican revolution was very much tied to Saturn-Pluto, the Saturn-Pluto cycle. And in a way, the problem with this particular Saturn-Pluto cycle is that where it has taken hold is also boundary issues. Unfortunately, we can't just build a wall to keep out whatever the invader is here, that again, the invader, whether it's a virus or whether it's fear, seems to have penetrated our defenses. And so what we have here as we approach April 3rd, with Mercury coming up to Neptune, again, Neptune's role here is the fuzziness of all of this. It's the uncertainty of not knowing. Remember, Pluto disintegrates, it takes down, it deconstructs that which exists, and Pluto-Saturn, basically Pluto deconstructs the hard walls, the boundaries of Saturn, which is part of, you know, the deeper symbolic archetypal issue that's going on here. But meanwhile, through April 3rd, as Mercury is approaching Neptune, we might find that there's more and more confusion. What is real? What is going on? What are we seeing on the media that's true? What is it that's either exaggerated or downplayed, and for whose purpose? And so it becomes more difficult, I think, until Mercury clears Neptune, and for that matter, I would say even until Mercury makes it all the way through Mercury makes it all the way through Pisces, and that becomes another piece, because when Mercury moves into Aries on April 10th, I think we'll begin to see intellect clearing up a little bit, but we'll get to that in just a moment. All right, so moving this ahead a day at a time, we have also another aspect coming into play here. So as Venus moves into Gemini, Venus is now catching up with Saturn, and that Venus trine to Saturn is exact on April 4th. You can see here April 4th, 5th, Venus moves past the degree of Saturn. And when Venus trines Saturn, there's a sense of reality that comes in. I think that Saturn plays an important role here. And I think it's really important for us to put things into perspective. And I think that Venus's trine to Saturn is an important perspective-giving aspect because it helps us see the longer play here. Now, remember, Venus has also been making a trine to Mars. The exact trine to Mars is already passed. But that becomes an important aspect also because we have Chiron here in early Aries. And as Mars and Venus both move through 4 or 5 degrees of Aquarius, Mars in Aquarius, and Venus in Gemini, they will both make sextiles with Chiron. And I think here we have an aspect that's very important because it actually has a bit to do with the whole healing nature of what's going on. And that Chiron is aspected, the Mars sextile to Chiron occurs on April 8th. And the Venus sextile to Chiron occurs on April 10th. And then Mercury moving through Aries lines up with Chiron on April 14th. And all of those, I think, are part of the realization of the situation that we're in and potential routes to recovery or to taking the information that we know and working with it. But let's come back now to April 4th, because we have another piece here that is occurring that is beginning to build, and that is that Mars, moving rather quickly now in Aquarius, is pushing toward a square to Uranus. And we're going to move this ahead a day at a time. Now we're going to watch that Mars gaining on Uranus, and the exact actual conjunction, the exact square occurs on the 7th. And the 7th actually becomes important from a number of standpoints, one of which is we have a full moon during this period of time. Okay, so here we have a chart for the Libra full moon on April 7th. That's at 7:35 p.m. Pacific time. That's 10:35 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And this full moon is interesting because of the involvement of Chiron and because of the Mars square Uranus. Now, normally when we look at a full moon, we want to look and see what aspects it makes to other planets. Obviously, it's making an opposition to the sun. Libra full moons are always in some way a dance or a power struggle or a relationship between the inner and the outer. The Aries represents the I, me, mine. Aries is the self. Libra is the self in relationship to another. And so you can't have a tug of war without an Aries-Libra relationship. It's the internal, external. It's any opposites. And here we have the, how does the I, my survival, my perspective, my health, my family, my home, my survival, how does that fit into the to the environment? I think it's important to understand here, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far, but the difference between strict germ theory and environmental impact, because a lot of whether or not an organism is healthy or not is not just the introduction of an outside germ, it's the stability and the environment, whether it's healthy or unhealthy. And in some ways, this Libra full moon, I think, is pointing out the unhealthiness of our environment that has forced many of us to begin to look at what's going on out there in the world versus what we can do to strengthen our own selves. And I think this is spoken to by the quincunx between the moon and Neptune. Now remember, Mercury is pulling away from Neptune already. That conjunction happened on the 3rd. But the quincunx, remember, quincunxes are awkward, they're irritating. And with the moon in Libra giving that awareness to the self, that opposition of self to other, the moon's quincunx to Neptune at 19 degrees of Pisces, from almost 19 degrees, 18 and 3/4 degrees of Libra, is very much in the uncertainty that comes to how we respond without having clarity. And again, I think this is a large part of the deeper issue here of the lack of clarity that we have as to what's going on, what we're feeling versus what's actually occurring out there, what we're being told versus what's occurring. The levels of complexity around this, I think, are coming out at this full moon. The other thing is that with Mars squaring Uranus, Mars square Uranus can be explosive. And I don't mean explosive meaning physically like dynamite. I mean explosive in as much as Mars is impulsive, Mars is reactive, Mars is red hot. And Uranus has the tension stretched enough that when Mars comes in, if there's tension, something's going to give. It's like if there's a really strong tug of war going on and you have a Mars square Uranus, the rope might break, for example. Now, on one hand, that frees the people on either end of the rope from having to be engaged in this stressful situation. On the other hand, it might be upset one's balance because one's engaged in holding on to that tension. So I think here through that first week of April, we might see some things give or some things give way that are a bit unexpected in this larger process, because Uranus often has to do with things that are unexpected. But here's the good news that sits behind all of this, and that is at the time of this full moon, Venus and Mars, Venus at 3, almost 4 degrees of Gemini, and Mars at 5, almost 6 degrees of Aquarius, are both within a couple of degrees of being trine to one another, but they're both making sextiles with Chiron, Chiron the healer. And here we come back again to the, now what I'm thinking of, there's an adage that comes from somewhere, it may be Hippocrates, that goes, physician, heal thyself. You know, the idea of the wounded healer is that we try to project our own illnesses and fix them in others rather than dealing with them in ourselves. And here we have Chiron in Aries, the sign of the self. We have the sun in Aries, the sign of the self. I sometimes call Aries the I, me, mine, even though Aries can certainly be the most reactive, caring, compassionate, and taking charge when it comes to the health and well-being of others. There's something that says in Aries, the awareness is that the well-being of others is really part of my own health. And so here with these positive, with these strengthening aspects to Chiron, I expect that we will see some progress made on that level. We also have in here Mercury forming a sextile with that Pluto-Jupiter. Mercury forms a sextile with Pluto and Jupiter on the day of the full moon. And so that, again, is bringing things out into the open. And I think here the key to surviving this is twofold. It's one, taking care of ourselves and building our immune systems and strengthening our own being. But two, that requires having good information. And good information is unfortunately difficult to get these days. There's a lot of information, but it's hard to tell which is valid and which is not, which is most useful and which is not. And I think this Mercury sextile to the Jupiter and Pluto will bring out some really useful and positive information in this scenario. Now, as we move this forward, on April 8th, we can see the sextile between Mars and Chiron, and then on the 10th, we can see the exact sextile between Venus and Chiron that I spoke about just a moment ago. But now we also see that on the 10th, we see that Mercury is at 29 degrees Pisces, 21 minutes, and actually in the evening of April 10th, I'm going to move this to the 11th, we can see that Mercury moving into Aries all of a sudden, where we want to take the new information that we have, we want to do something with it. It's almost like we're waking up from the fog of that Mercury being so long, in Neptune, in the sign of Neptune, in Neptune's sign. And I think that as Mercury moves into Aries, it begins to pick up on a sextile to Saturn, and then over the days ahead, it picks up on a sextile to Venus and to Mars. And I think that these are all strengthening the entire idea that information and communication is really important. Mercury will then also move to a conjunction to Chiron, and those Mercury aspects are here. Mercury moves into Aries on April 10th. It sextiles Saturn on the 11th. It conjuncts Chiron on the 14th. Jump this down to the 14th. There's Mercury conjuncting Chiron. And then on the 17th and 18th, it sextiles first Venus there, and then Mars. And we can see all that happening through the 18th. And here we can see that Venus-Mars being so close to trine also. And again, I think that these are all very positive signs. Now, again, positive signs in a time of extraordinary global meltdown, lockdown, whatever you want to call it, may not be quite the same as a positive sign in times that are much more fluid. But these are all important things to make note of as we move through the month. Another thing, though, is that on April 14th, we have another scenario that begins that I think is significant all month. On April 14th, so the moon moves into Capricorn back here late in the day on April 12th. And as the moon moves into Capricorn over the next couple of days on the 13th, on the 14th, and even into the 15th, that moon moving through Capricorn is going to come across the area of sky where the Saturn-Pluto conjunction was, where Pluto is, where Jupiter is, and then as it moves into Aquarius, it's going to come into conjunction with Saturn and with Mars. And so I think what we're going to see during this period of time is another replay of old energies, another round of awareness here on the 14th, when the moon is conjuncting Pluto, and the sun is actually squaring Pluto. So this is a third quarter square. We're coming into the new moon, which will be the new moon will be on April 22nd in Taurus. But this moon conjunct Pluto and Jupiter, while the sun on the 14th and 15th is squaring Pluto and Jupiter, is very significant. And I think here we have a round of who's in control, what's going on. I mean, it's not an easy square when the sun squares both Jupiter and Pluto together. It's like there's deep energies at play, and they're coming out into the open, and they may create some dynamic conflict or stress. Now, this is happening, while we have the sextiles building, to Chiron and the Mercury-Chiron conjunction occurring. So this is certainly an interesting time, but we may feel by the time that the sun moves into Taurus, which is, let's just zap this ahead a couple more days, the sun moves into Taurus on April 19th, early in the morning. So that there's the sun having moved from Aries into Taurus. But once the sun moves into Taurus, it's picking up on a square to Saturn. And that sun square Saturn, again, is we have decisions to make. These are major decisions. These are go, no go decisions. And those decisions may be personal, they may be national, they may be global, but there's restrictions here. Saturn doing that holding back. And that brings us toward the new moon, which occurs at 7:25 p.m. on April 22nd. The significance of this new moon is important because normally the new moon in Taurus is a stability check. It's a place where we actually can reground, put our feet somewhere firm, reestablish a center of gravity, and yet I don't think we quite get to do that in the way we want to. It's important that the new moon occurs after the sun's square to Saturn, after the moon's square to Saturn, because the new moon is at 3.5 degrees of Taurus, with Saturn being back at 1.5, 1 3/4 degrees of Aquarius. And so I think in some ways there is a bit of stability or reality check here. However, it's hard to actually feel stable while that new moon is conjuncting Uranus. It's 3 degrees away, which means that approximately 6 hours after that new moon, the moon will actually conjunct Uranus, and approximately 3 days after that new moon, the sun will conjunct Uranus. That's actually 4 days. It's very early in the morning, 2 a.m. Pacific time, on April 26th. So we're going to move this forward a day at a time, and we're going to watch this new moon, which again is squaring Saturn. And Saturn is also coming toward a square to Uranus. This is something we'll talk about more as the year unfolds, but it's really an issue of 2021 rather than an issue of 2020, although we're getting first waves of it with Saturn now just 5 degrees away from that square, because Saturn square Uranus, Saturn is the restriction, Saturn is the wall, Saturn is the reality check, Saturn is the karma, and Uranus is the irrepressible need to break through, break out. It's the ingenious, the sudden changes. And I think we'll see that dynamic playing out more, especially next year. But we're getting some of that, some foreshadowing here as this new moon is actually squaring Saturn and coming into conjuncting Uranus over the days ahead. And there we can see the moon moving away. And now by the 25th, and actually the sun's conjunction to Uranus is late night 25th or early in the morning on the 26th. It's 2 a.m. Pacific time or 5 a.m. Eastern time on the 26th that sun conjuncts Uranus. And again here, we might see another spike in numbers that's unpleasant to deal with. We might see something happen that's totally unexpected. But this is, in some ways, this is part of a breakthrough. And yet at the same time, we now have Mercury making a square to those points and planets back in Capricorn that the sun did earlier, and that Mercury making that square to both Pluto and Jupiter, and then eventually to Saturn, actually on the 28th, because Mercury is moving so quickly, that this can be a time of difficult communication. Now, I should say one other thing that's occurring right at this time, and that is Pluto, which has been a key player in all of this because of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Pluto turns retrograde. Now, although Saturn and Pluto don't align again, Pluto now moves retrograde and backs up toward the point at which Saturn and Pluto were conjunct. And Pluto's retrograde here at the time of the new moon and then a few days after might be an interesting counterpoint to all of this as the energy intensifies. And the intensification may not be over the virus itself. The intensification may be over our reaction and our response to it and to other things that have been developing. But we will see that Mercury squaring Pluto and Jupiter, and then coming into square Saturn by the 28th. Whoop, there it is right there. Actually, the Mercury square Saturn is very early. It's early in the morning on the 28th. And so here we can see that once Mercury moves into Taurus on the 27th, that comes into play. Now, Mercury moving into Taurus, again, normally would be solidification and stabilization. However, that Mercury is moving toward Uranus. And although Mercury doesn't reach the conjunction with Uranus until April 30th, I think as soon as Mercury moves into Taurus, we're going to feel some of that, the next round of, oh my God, craziness, instability. And I know that might be frightening in respect to how much instability there is now. But this also is part of the cure. I think that part of what we're dealing with right now is the coming to terms with the facts and dealing with them so that we can move through these times. Again, these are extraordinary times, and if we were just to take the specific astrological aspects that I've talked about completely out of context, it wouldn't seem like it was all that intense a month. Oh, sure, I mean, there is stuff going on. When you play the larger picture behind this, you begin to see the amount of stress that normally would be easy to deal with. But again, it comes back to what I said earlier in today's talk, and that is it's very difficult to be sane in an insane world. It's very difficult to be healthy in a world that's sick. It's very difficult for an organism to be healthy in an environment that is unhealthy. And I am hesitant to say this one more time, but people are saying it all over. Yes, there is a real problem. There's a real severe situation going on. However, that situation is an acute flowering of a situation that's already been going on. And that situation that's already been going on is a massive die-off of species on this planet. You know, I don't care where you fall on what some people think is the obviousness of climate change. I don't even care whether you believe that it's man-made or if it's not man-made. That's an argument that I would love to engage someone on, but not here, because we don't have time or energy to have those kinds of stupid arguments. What we know is that there is massive change in the climate. We know that there is a massive die-off of species, of extinctions on a level that we haven't seen in hundreds of thousands of years. This is not something that is arguable. This is just a fact. Now, I'm bringing this up because the environment is sick. There's something happening in the environment that is not healthy. And herein is where I bring in my last thought for the day. And that is one of the things that I think is being cured right now is this illusion that many people live under, and that is the illusion that we are separate from nature, that we are separate from our environment. We are, in fact, part of our environment. One of the basic tenets of astrology comes from the emerald tablets, which say, as above, so below. The within of things is as the without of things. And so to say that there's illness and sickness out there, and to say that, oh yeah, but it doesn't affect us, I think is just a foolhardy leftover from what we call the Age of Enlightenment, where we thought that intellect could overcome nature, only to discover, as Rob Hand calls it, the Age of Endarkenment, not the Age of Enlightenment. Not that it didn't bring many, many good things, it did. But the fact of the matter is that one of the things that we're having to come to terms with is that we are not separate from nature. We are not creating things that are unnatural. Nature is all-encompassing. We are part of nature. And we don't get to cure ourselves while still making nature sicker and sicker. This is a cure that we're all going through together. And these are extraordinary times. And extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. And I encourage each and every one of you, each and every one of us, because we are all in this together, to establish community, establish family, to rely on our social networking, even if we have to do it through media like this, where we are socially connected but physically removed. Whatever it takes, take care of yourself. These are strange and extraordinary times. I will make my mid-month update that normally is only for Patreon subscribers. I will make that available again for everyone. I would also like to remind you that my daily updates are now available on Instagram, and that is, my Instagram account is Rick Levine Astrologer, one word, Rick Levine Astrologer. And so you can find my dailies there. And if you want to support the work that I'm doing, feel free. I invite you to go to Patreon, and that's Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/Rick Levine. And I will see you all next month. And again, more than ever, think cosmically, but act locally.